Hey everyone, welcome back to Steve's View. Over the last decade, something massive has been happening across the Western world, and most traditional politicians still don't fully understand it. The old political map is breaking apart. Not just in America, not just in Britain, across the entire West. For years, the political establishment kept telling voters that politics was mainly about economics, taxes, interest rates, trade policy, GDP growth, government spending. The assumption was simple. If the economy performed reasonably well, most people would stay loyal to the traditional parties that had dominated politics for generations. But that model is starting to collapse. Because more and more voters are no longer voting mainly based on economics. They're voting based on identity, culture, immigration, national sovereignty, trust, and perhaps most importantly, whether they still feel represented by the people running their countries. That's why what just happened in Britain matters far more than most American media outlets are admitting. Because the rise of Reform UK is not just another temporary protest movement, it may be the clearest sign yet that British politics is entering an entirely new era. And honestly, if you look closely, what's happening in Britain looks surprisingly similar to what already happened in the United States. For years, Britain was dominated by two major parties, Labour on the left and the Conservatives on the right. Governments changed, leaders changed, policies changed, but the overall structure of the system stayed stable. That stability is now breaking down. The recent local elections in Britain delivered a political shockwave through the entire country. Reform UK, led by Nigel Farage, made huge gains across multiple regions, especially in working-class areas that were once considered safe Labour territory. And that part is critical, because this is not simply a conservative uprising. It's a realignment of the working class itself. For decades, Western left-wing parties depended heavily on industrial workers, union members, and lower-income voters. That coalition defined modern progressive politics throughout much of the 20th century. But globalization changed everything. Manufacturing declined. Communities hollowed out. Local industries disappeared. And many working-class voters increasingly felt that left-wing parties stopped representing them culturally, even if they still claimed to represent them economically. That disconnect became explosive after the migration crises of the last decade. Now, suddenly, millions of voters across Europe and America feel like the political establishment cares more about abstract global ideals than about the actual people living in their own countries. And whether you agree with that perception or not, politically, it's incredibly powerful. That's the emotional engine driving movements like Reform UK. People often describe these movements as far-right, populist, or anti-establishment, but I think that misses something important. At their core, these movements are fueled by a sense of abandonment. A huge number of ordinary voters believe the ruling class stopped listening to them years ago. They believe political elites became detached from everyday national life, detached from rising living costs, detached from community decline, detached from cultural anxiety, detached from immigration pressures, detached from national identity itself. And once voters start feeling abandoned, they become willing to support parties that would have seemed politically impossible only 10 years earlier. That's exactly what happened with Donald Trump in the United States. And now Britain may be entering a similar phase. What's fascinating about Reform UK is that it's no longer functioning merely as a Brexit nostalgia party. For a long time, many people dismissed Farage's movement as a one-issue reaction to the European Union. The assumption was that once Brexit happened, the movement would slowly fade away. That clearly didn't happen. Instead, the movement evolved. Now Reform UK is becoming a broader political vehicle for voters who feel alienated from Britain's entire political system. That includes former conservative voters angry about immigration, working-class Labour voters frustrated with progressive cultural politics, middle-income voters squeezed by inflation and economic stagnation, nationalists concerned about sovereignty and identity, anti-establishment voters who no longer trust traditional media or institutions. That's a much larger coalition than many people realize. And here's the key point. This isn't just happening because people suddenly became more ideological. It's happening because trust in institutions is collapsing. This is the deeper crisis affecting almost every Western democracy right now. People no longer trust governments the way they once did. They don't trust the media. They don't trust experts. They don't trust major corporations. They don't trust universities. They don't trust bureaucracies. And increasingly, they don't even trust elections themselves. Once institutional trust starts collapsing, political systems become unstable very quickly. Because voters stop asking, which party has the better policy? Instead, they start asking, which party is actually on my side? That emotional shift changes everything. And it's one reason why establishment parties across Europe keep struggling to contain populist movements. Traditional politicians often respond to these movements by treating them as temporary emotional outbursts. They assume voters will eventually return to normal. But what if this is the new normal? What if the old political order is permanently weakening? That possibility terrifies the political establishment. Because if voters no longer organize primarily around class or economics, but instead around culture and identity, the entire structure of modern Western politics changes. And honestly, I think we're already seeing that happen. Look at Britain right now. Labour is facing a huge contradiction. On one side, it depends heavily on progressive urban voters, university-educated professionals, younger voters, and multicultural coalitions concentrated in major cities. On the other side, it still needs working-class support in older industrial regions. The problem is that these groups increasingly want very different things. Urban progressive voters often prioritize issues like diversity, climate policy, social justice, and multiculturalism. Many working-class voters are more concerned about immigration, public safety, national identity, energy prices, and economic security. Trying to hold those groups together is becoming extremely difficult. That's why Labour increasingly looks trapped. If it moves further left culturally, it risks losing more working-class voters to Reform UK. If it moves toward cultural moderation, it risks angering its progressive urban base. This is not just a British problem. The Democratic Party in America faces many of the same tensions. Meanwhile, the Conservative Party in Britain is dealing with its own existential crisis, because Reform UK is attacking it from the right in exactly the same way Trump reshaped the Republican Party in the United States. And here's what makes this especially dangerous for traditional conservatives. Voters often punish perceived weakness more than ideological disagreement. Many conservative voters believe the Conservative Party talked tough about immigration and sovereignty for years, but failed to deliver meaningful change. That frustration creates space for more populist alternatives. Again, this should sound very familiar to Americans. What Trump understood before most Republican politicians did was that millions of voters no longer wanted carefully managed conservatism. They wanted confrontation. They wanted disruption. They wanted someone willing to attack the system itself. Farage understands this dynamic too. That's why Reform UK's rhetoric is often emotionally direct and anti-establishment. Now, does this mean Reform UK is guaranteed to dominate British politics? No, and I think some commentators are exaggerating how quickly this transformation will happen. Britain's electoral system still creates enormous barriers for smaller parties. Unlike proportional systems in Europe, Britain's first-past-the-post structure heavily favors large, established parties. A party can win a substantial share of the national vote and still end up with relatively few parliamentary seats. That's a major obstacle for Reform UK. There's another issue too. Movements built heavily around populist energy often depend enormously on charismatic leadership, and Nigel Farage is absolutely central to Reform UK's identity. That creates long-term vulnerability, because personality-driven political movements can struggle to institutionalize themselves once the original leader fades from the scene. We've seen versions of this problem in many countries. Still, I think people underestimate how much the psychological foundations of Western politics are shifting. For decades, Western societies operated under a broad elite consensus. Globalization was considered good. Mass migration was manageable. Multiculturalism was largely celebrated. International institutions were viewed positively. Economic integration was assumed to be inevitable. National identity became less emphasized among political elites. But large parts of the population never fully accepted all of those assumptions. And after years of economic stagnation, migration pressures, cultural fragmentation, housing crises, and declining trust, that dissatisfaction finally found political expression. That's why populist movements are appearing almost everywhere simultaneously. Not because voters in every country suddenly became extremists, but because many ordinary people increasingly feel disconnected from the societies their elites are building. Now, obviously, there are real dangers in populist politics too. Some populist movements oversimplify complex problems. Some rely too heavily on anger rather than governance. Some create unrealistic expectations. Some drift into conspiracy thinking or permanent outrage politics, and governing is much harder than campaigning. That's important to remember. But establishment parties also created many of the conditions that allowed populism to explode in the first place. When institutions become too insulated from public frustration, backlash eventually arrives. And usually it arrives suddenly. That's what Britain may be experiencing now. The deeper issue here is that Western politics is increasingly becoming organized around cultural identity rather than traditional economic class. That shift changes political coalitions dramatically. Highly educated urban professionals increasingly cluster on the left. Non-college working-class voters increasingly move rightward. Big cities become more progressive. Small towns and rural regions become more nationalist and culturally conservative. You can see this pattern not only in Britain and America, but across much of Europe. And once politics becomes identity-based instead of purely economic, compromise becomes much harder. Because people stop feeling like they're debating policies. They start feeling like they're defending ways of life. That's why modern politics feels so emotionally intense. Immigration debates are no longer just about labor markets. They're about national identity. Climate debates are no longer just about energy policy. They're about culture and class. Education debates are no longer just about schools. They're about competing visions of civilization itself. Everything becomes symbolic. Everything becomes existential. And social media amplifies all of it constantly. Now, personally, I don't think Britain is collapsing. I don't think America is collapsing either. But I do think both countries are entering a much more unstable political era than the one that existed from roughly the 1990s through the early 2010s. The old centrist consensus is weakening. The old party systems are fragmenting, and new political identities are emerging. What happens next depends heavily on whether traditional institutions can adapt to this new reality. Can mainstream parties rebuild trust? Can democratic systems absorb populist anger without becoming permanently destabilized? Can national identity coexist with multicultural modern societies? Can governments restore confidence without becoming more authoritarian? Those are incredibly difficult questions. And honestly, nobody fully knows the answers yet. But one thing is becoming increasingly clear. The rise of Reform UK is not just a British story. It's part of a much larger transformation happening across the Western world. A transformation driven by distrust, identity, cultural conflict, and the feeling among millions of ordinary people that the world changed faster than they were prepared for. And whether political elites like it or not, those feelings are now reshaping the future of Western democracy itself. Thanks for watching.